It's Dr. T here, and today we're answering the question, why are there still so many poor people in the United States? First, a couple of terms to understand what we're talking about here. When we talk about poverty, we can talk about absolute versus relative poverty. So absolute is the inability to meet your basic needs like food, clothing, and shelter. Relative is in comparison to someone else. So there are many people who would be considered poor here in the United States, but if we looked at them relative to people in poorer countries around the world, they would be much more affluent in comparison. We also can talk about income versus wealth. Income is the money that you earn, and wealth is often referred to as the money that works for you. So poor people tend not to have a lot of wealth. They tend not to have homes where they're building up equity, and they don't tend to be investing in things like the stock market. Poor people are at the bottom of our socioeconomic ladder or our social class system in the United States. So we often divide the class system into 5 classes: the upper class, the upper middle class, the working class, and the poor class. But sometimes it's divided into lower middle class. A lot of people who are in the working class may actually be working poor because even though they are earning an income, they are below the poverty line. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. So the poverty rate is calculated based on the number of people who are poor per 1,000 people in the population. So right now, the poverty rate is just over 11%. Now, this rate changes over time, but it's based on the number of people living below the poverty line. And right now, for 2025, the poverty line is set at, for one person, $15,060. For 2 people, $20,440. For 3 people, $25,820. And for 4 people, $31,200. And it's $5,000 per person for every person over that. Now, the poverty line, many economists argue, is kept artificially low, meaning that there actually are a lot of people who are struggling in an absolute sense to meet those basic needs, but they are living above the poverty line in terms of the dollars that they bring into their home. The reason the poverty line is kept so low is because by law, the federal government has to provide aid such as food stamps and Medicaid in particular to anyone who earns 130% of the poverty line or below. So the lower we can keep the poverty line, the fewer people that our tax dollars have to help. So that is the incentive, and that's why that's done. Okay, so why are there still so many poor people? Certainly, policy has an impact. For example, when Johnson signed the War on Poverty legislation, the Great Society legislation in the mid-1960s, it cut the poverty rate in half. When we had the COVID epidemic, people were losing their job and the poverty rate started to soar, but we enacted policies like extended unemployment and more generous food stamp benefits so that people were able to live above that poverty threshold. Minimum wage, however, has not really kept up with the cost of living changes over time. So in the mid-'80s, the minimum wage was $3.35 an hour. It didn't change until 2009 when it came to $7.50 an hour. It hasn't changed since that time. Some cities and states have increased their minimum wage. California, New York, other cities have done this to try to help people earn a livable wage. One of the problems is that housing has skyrocketed, particularly in our urban areas, but also in a lot of areas that attract tourists. People want to live there, it's desirable, housing costs go up, and people are not able to afford housing. But the original question, okay, why are there still so many poor people? Yes, there have been shifts in housing and other things, but the sociologist Herbert Gans, who studied poverty, said that there actually were some functions served, some benefits to at least a part of the population, or maybe society as a whole, by having a certain number of people who continue to live in poverty. One very practical function is that If we have people who are very poor, they are more desperate and they are more willing to do the kinds of jobs that many of us would turn our noses up at because they are too physically demanding, or they're just plain dealing with dirty, smelly, unpleasant things. So we know we've got somebody who's willing to do those jobs. There are psychological benefits. So for example, those of us who are maybe in the middle somewhere of that socioeconomic ladder, we can look at poor people and say, well, I might be struggling. I might have a hard time meeting my bills sometimes, but at least I'm not living like they are, right? I'm better off, relatively speaking, right? There's that comparison, than they are. We also very often will scapegoat the poor for our social problems. Well, crime is terrible because the poor are out there committing crimes, or drugs are a problem because the poor are out there doing drugs. Those things aren't true, but it makes us feel better to have someone to scapegoat, someone to blame for the problems that we have. It's easier for us when we can do that. In practical terms, having people who are not able to afford to buy new things, for example, creates businesses and job opportunities for people in what we call the secondary market. So those who would run thrift shops, those who run pawn shops, those who are payday lenders, they have jobs. We have a place to sell our used goods. If I want to buy a new car, I have someone who maybe can't afford a new car who might be willing to buy the used car I've been driving for several years. We also have one benefit of the poor to the rest of society is that they will absorb the cost of social change. So that if we need something new in an area, we're going to put in a new expressway, we're going to put in a trash incinerator complex, we're going to put those in poor neighborhoods, not in neighborhoods with more affluent people, because poor people are much less likely to have the means to organize or pay for attorneys to fight something like this in court. So we often push things onto the poor that are less desirable because they don't have the resources to fight back. So the next episode, we're going to talk more about this scapegoating. In particular, we often will scapegoat the poor. Oh, they're taking up so much money in my taxes. I wouldn't have to pay so much in taxes if it weren't for them. Not so fast. Stay tuned.